On Fifth Avenue, in the early 1890s, a woman named Caroline Astor ruled New York society like a queen with a guest list. Her mansion was a symbol, her windows a throne. But one morning, she looked out and saw 13 floors of fresh stone rising beside her home, so close it felt deliberate. It was a hotel, not across town, not down the street, right next door, built by her own blood, William Waldorf Astor. And it was not built to make money. It was built to block her sunlight, steal her silence, and break her reign. The Queen of New York takes notes. Before the hotel war begins, you have to understand the one woman who decides who matters and who disappears. Carolyn Webster. Schermerhorn. Astor did not need a title to be royalty. She needed a ballroom, and she had one. 350 square feet of polished floor inside her mansion at 350 East 34th Street and Fifth Avenue, where the ceiling dripped with crystal and the walls were hung with mirrors that reflected power back at itself. The ballroom held exactly 400 people, not 401, not 399, 400, and if you were not among them, you did not exist. This was not cruelty. This was architecture as citizenship. Caroline had turned her home into a sorting machine, and New York society fed itself through her doors every winter season. The men who owned railroads stood beside the women who married fortunes. Senators brushed shoulders with shipping heirs. Everyone smiled. Everyone knew the rules. And the first rule was simple. Caroline decides. She was born a Schermerhorn, which meant old money, Dutch roots, and the kind of name that carried weight before it carried a fortune. She married William Backhouse Astor Jr., which meant newer money, property empires, and a last name that sounded like a dynasty because it was one. Together, they became the axis around which Manhattan's elite revolved. But William was not the one writing invitations. William was not the one standing at the top of the staircase in Worth gowns, greeting guests like a monarch receiving tribute. That was Caroline. Always Caroline. Her method was precise. She worked with Ward McAllister, a social arbiter who treated etiquette like constitutional law. Together, they created the 400, a list of names that defined acceptable society. It was not official. It was not published. It did not need to be. Everyone knew if they were in or out. The list existed in whispers and empty chairs. If your name was called, you ascended. If it was not, you vanished into the margin of the city, rich but irrelevant. Fifth Avenue was the proving ground. The mansions were not just homes. They were declarations. Limestone fortresses built shoulder to shoulder, each one a monument to taste, bloodline, and the belief that money should never apologize for itself. The Vanderbilts had their chateau, the Whitneys had their palace, and Caroline had her stronghold, positioned like a castle keep, watching the avenue bend to her will. Inside, the rooms were a study in controlled excess. Silk wallpaper imported from France, furniture carved from rosewood and mahogany, paintings in gilded frames, chosen not for beauty, but for pedigree. Every object had a story. Every story reinforced the same message. This family was here first, and they were staying. But the house was more than decoration. It was a machine. Servants moved through hidden corridors, ensuring that no guest ever saw the labor that made luxury possible. Food appeared on time. Fires stayed lit. Glasses stayed full. The illusion was seamless, and the illusion was the point. Wealth was not meant to be loud. It was meant to be inevitable. Caroline understood this better than anyone. She did not shout her power. She performed it. Every ball was a ceremony. Every invitation was a verdict. She stood at the center of it all, dressed in diamonds that caught the gaslight, speaking in a voice that never needed to rise. People leaned in to hear her. They always did. And for years, it worked. The system held. The families intermarried, the fortunes grew, and Fifth Avenue remained a private kingdom where the right names controlled the gates. Caroline was not just a hostess. She was the code itself, the living constitution of who mattered in New York. But codes can be challenged. And in the Astor family, there was one name that refused to bow. A cousin learns his name is not enough. William Waldorf. Astor is rich beyond reason and still furious because Caroline will not treat him like a king. He was born into the same fortune. His grandfather was John Jacob Astor, the fur trader who turned pelts into real estate and real estate into an empire. By the time William Waldorf inherited his share, the family holdings stretched across Manhattan like a grid of ownership. Buildings, land, rents. The money came in whether he worked or not. And he did not work, not in any way Caroline would recognize. William Waldorf fancied himself a statesman. He served as a minister to Italy, a role he took seriously, and New York society did not. He wrote novels, historical fiction about ancient Rome and noble ambition, books that sold modestly and were reviewed politely. He believed in titles, in rank, in the idea that a man of his breeding deserved deference simply for existing. And when he returned to New York in the late 1880s, he expected the city to recognize what he had always known about himself, that he was the rightful head of the Astor line. Caroline disagreed, not publicly. She did not need to be public. She simply continued hosting her balls, sending her invitations, and signing her name as Mrs. Astor. Not Mrs. William Backhouse Astor Jr., not Caroline Astor, just Mrs. Astor, as if there could only be one. William Waldorf had a wife too, Mary Dahlgren Paul, a woman of impeccable lineage and quiet dignity. She wanted to be known as Mrs. Astor as well. It was her right, technically. William Waldorf was the eldest male heir. The title, by tradition, should have passed to his household, but tradition meant nothing if Caroline ignored it. And Caroline did ignore it, with the kind of silence that cut deeper than any insult. The social ledger was clear. When the newspapers wrote about Mrs. Astor, they meant Caroline. When invitations arrived addressed to Mrs. Astor, they went to Caroline's mansion. When people spoke of the Astor Ball, they meant Caroline's ballroom, Caroline's guest list, Caroline's 400. William Waldorf's wife was reduced to a footnote, a secondary Astor, a woman with the name but not the throne. It burned. Slowly at first, then completely. William Waldorf was a man who measured his life in hierarchies, and this one refused to crown him. He had the money. He had the pedigree. He had the legal claim to primacy. But he did not have the one thing that mattered in Caroline's world: her permission. He tried logic. He tried letters. He tried appealing to family loyalty and the natural order of succession. None of it worked. Caroline's power was not legal. It was atmospheric. She did not argue. She simply continued being Mrs. Astor, and the world continued agreeing with her. So, William Waldorf stopped asking. He stopped attending her events. He stopped pretending the family could share the same avenue without a schism. Instead, he began to think in architectural terms. If he could not control the guest list, he would control the skyline. If he could not dominate society, he would rewrite the geography beneath it. He owned property, lots of it, and some of it sat directly beside Caroline's mansion. a plot of land that had been in the family for decades, inherited and ignored. It was supposed to remain residential, a buffer zone that kept Fifth Avenue orderly and elite. But William Waldorf had no interest in order. He had interest in a statement. In 1890, he announced plans to build a hotel. Not just any hotel, a luxury palace, 13 stories tall, rising directly beside Caroline's home, the Waldorf Hotel. Named after the German village his ancestors came from, a name that carried European aristocracy in its syllables. It would have 500 rooms, a grand dining hall, electric lights, elevators, everything modern wealth could demand, placed inches from the woman who refused to recognize him. The decision was not about profit. William Waldorf Astor did not need hotel revenue. This was about proximity as punishment, about turning her private sanctuary into a public stage, about making sure that every time she looked out her window, she would see his name carved in stone, taller than her roofline, blocking her light. Construction began. The city watched, and Caroline, for the first time in decades, had to decide whether to bend or break. The hotel built like an insult. 13 stories rise beside her mansion, and suddenly Caroline's world has windows staring straight into it. The Waldorf Hotel opened on March 13th, 1893. The date was not accidental. It was planned, promoted, and executed like a debut. 500 guests walked through doors framed in polished brass. They climbed marble staircases lit by chandeliers that burned bright enough to announce themselves from blocks away. They dined on oysters and champagne in rooms designed to make private wealth look quaint. This was not a building. This was a proclamation. The hotel stood 13 stories tall, which meant it towered over every mansion on the block. Caroline's home, with its elegant 4 floors and private gardens, suddenly looked like something history had forgotten to demolish. The Waldorf's facade was German Renaissance revival, all carved stone and ornamental detail, built to suggest old-world nobility transplanted into New York ambition. It was beautiful. It was also a middle finger rendered in limestone. The scale was deliberate. The Waldorf contained 530 rooms, each one designed for short-term luxury. Guests paid $5 a night for a standard room, $50 for a suite, prices that placed the hotel firmly in the realm of the wealthy, but not the exclusive. This was the key insult. Anyone with money could stay there. You did not need Caroline's approval. You did not need a bloodline. You needed a checkbook. Inside, the public spaces were designed to overwhelm. The main dining room stretched across 3,000 square feet, with ceilings tall enough to swallow conversation and floors polished to a reflective gleam. The palm room, filled with potted trees and wicker furniture, offered a tropical fantasy in the middle of Manhattan. The ballroom could host 1,000 people, more than twice Caroline's capacity, and it was available to anyone who could afford to rent it. The hotel employed over 300 staff members: doormen, porters, maids, cooks, waiters, bellhops, an entire invisible army dedicated to making strangers feel like aristocrats. They worked in shifts, ensuring the building never slept, never dimmed, never stopped humming with the sound of commerce dressed as hospitality. And it was loud. Carriages arrived at all hours, clattering over cobblestones, depositing guests in furs and tailcoats. Luggage was unloaded. Doors opened and closed. Voices echoed through the porte cochere. The street, which had once been a quiet enclave of private wealth, became a parade ground for public display. Caroline's mansion shared a property line with the hotel. The gap between the buildings was less than 20 feet in some places, close enough that she could hear the kitchen staff shouting orders through the service entrance, close enough that light from the hotel's windows spilled into her garden at night, turning her private courtyard into a stage lit by someone else's production. The windows were the worst part. The Waldorf's guest rooms faced every direction, including west, directly, toward Caroline's home. Strangers could stand in their rented suites and look down into her life. They could see her garden, her terrace, the side entrance her family used. Privacy, the one luxury money was supposed to guarantee, had been sold to the highest bidder. William Waldorf did not attend the opening. He had already moved to England, taking his wife and children across the Atlantic, abandoning New York for a country that still respected titles and hierarchies. He left the hotel in the hands of George Bolt, a manager with a gift for spectacle and no interest in old society rules. Bolt ran the Waldorf like a theater, booking orchestras for the dining room and allowing journalists to roam the halls, writing breathless descriptions of the new American palace. The reviews were unanimous. The Waldorf was a triumph, modern, magnificent, a symbol of New York's transformation from colonial outpost to global capital. It proved that luxury did not need to hide behind family crests. It could advertise. It could expand. It could invite the whole world inside, as long as the world could pay. But for Caroline, the reviews meant nothing. The triumph was a siege. The hotel was not a neighbor. It was an invasion. And every guest who checked in was a reminder that her control over Fifth Avenue, over society itself, was no longer absolute. The street had betrayed her. Her own blood had weaponized it. And now she had to decide whether to endure the humiliation or destroy everything she had built to escape it. The war was no longer theoretical. It was brick and mortar. It was 13 floors of spite, and it was not going away. When luxury becomes a siege engine, the Waldorf does not just block the view, it changes who is allowed to exist on that block. Living beside the Waldorf was not like living beside another mansion. Mansions were predictable. Mansions belonged to families who kept schedules, who valued silence, who understood that proximity required a kind of unspoken diplomacy. The Waldorf had no diplomacy. It had operating hours, and those hours were all of them. Caroline's mornings began with the sound of deliveries, milk wagons, bread carts, sides of beef hauled through the service entrance before dawn. The hotel kitchen ran on a constant supply line, feeding hundreds of guests daily, and the logistics of that feeding started early. By 6 in the morning, the alley between the hotel and her mansion was already crowded with workers, crates, and the smell of food being prepared in industrial quantities. Then came the carriages. The Waldorf's main entrance faced Fifth Avenue, but the side entrance, the one for staff and suppliers, sat less than 30 feet from Caroline's parlor windows. All day, wheels scraped over stone. Horses stamped and snorted. Drivers shouted. The noise was not occasional. It was rhythmic, like living beside a train station that never closed. At night, the rhythm changed, but did not stop. Guests arrived late from the theater. They came in laughing, drunk on champagne and the novelty of spending money in public. The doorman greeted them with theatrical courtesy, voices loud enough to carry. Trunks were unloaded, tips exchanged. The building swallowed them, then lit their rooms, and the glow from 500 windows turned the street into permanent dusk. Caroline's servants began reporting strange things. Not ghosts, not yet, but the kind of atmospheric disturbance that comes from living too close to a machine. Cold drafts in hallways where no windows were open. Doors that would not stay latched. The constant sense of movement just beyond sight, which made sense when you considered the hotel employed 300 people who walked the same narrow alleys and shared the same property lines. The buildings were too close. The boundaries were too thin. Sound and sensation bled across them. Some of the staff swore they heard footsteps in the attic at odd hours, soft and deliberate, like someone pacing. But the attic was directly beneath the roofline, and the Waldorf's foundation work had caused settling across the entire block. Old houses creak when the ground shifts. Old houses develop personalities when the people inside them are already anxious. The footsteps could have been anything: pipes, beams, suggestion. Still, the stories persisted. A maid claimed she saw a figure in the garden one evening, standing near the hedge that separated Caroline's property from the hotel's loading zone. She blinked, and the figure was gone. Later, she learned a Waldorf guest had mistaken the gate for a shortcut. The explanation was mundane, but the feeling it left was not. The house, Caroline's fortress, no longer felt sealed. The crowds were worse than the noise. Fifth Avenue had always been exclusive because it was empty. The mansions were private. The families kept to themselves. Pedestrians were rare, and those who walked the avenue did so quietly, respectfully, as if the street itself demanded decorum. The Waldorf changed that overnight. Now the sidewalks were full. Tourists came to gawk at the hotel's entrance. Guests spilled out after dinner, smoking cigars and discussing business in voices that carried. Photographers set up tripods, capturing the facade for postcards. The street became a spectacle, and Caroline's home became part of the backdrop. She stopped using her front entrance. It felt too exposed, too much like stepping onto a stage where she had not sold tickets. Instead, she entered through the side, avoiding the main thoroughfare entirely. But even that route took her past the hotel's service alley, where she could see staff in white aprons hauling garbage, scrubbing floors, performing the labor that kept luxury convincing. The Waldorf had 530 guest rooms spread across 13 floors. Each floor had 40 rooms on average. Each room had at least 2 windows, and many of those windows faced west. That meant over 400 windows, pointed directly at Caroline's life. 400 frames through which strangers could watch her garden, her terrace, her comings and goings. Privacy was no longer guaranteed by property lines. It was negotiated with curtains. The hotel's dining room served 1,200 meals a day during peak season: breakfast, lunch, dinner, late supper. The kitchen never stopped. The staff never rested. The building consumed resources at a pace that would have bankrupted a family, but barely dented the hotel's revenue. George Bolt had turned hospitality into industry, and industry did not care about the neighbors. Caroline tried complaints. She sent letters to the city arguing that the hotel violated residential zoning, but there was no residential zoning. Fifth Avenue was governed by property rights and market logic, and William Waldorf owned the land. He could build what he wanted. The law was on his side. She tried social pressure. She made it known, quietly, that anyone who stayed at the Waldorf would not be welcome at her events. But the Waldorf's guests did not need her events. They had their own. Bolt hosted dinners for railroad magnates and theater stars, people with new money and no interest in Caroline's approval. The hotel created its own society, parallel and indifferent. The question was no longer whether Caroline could outlast the noise. It was whether she could survive the humiliation. The Waldorf had turned her mansion into a relic, a museum piece surrounded by the future. Every day she stayed, she confirmed what the hotel implied, that her kind of power was fading, and the city was moving on without her. But Caroline was not the type to fade quietly. She was the type to burn the whole block down and salt the earth, and that is exactly what she started planning. The night society realizes blood means nothing. In the Astor family, money is inherited, but obedience is negotiated, and tonight the negotiations fail. The first casualty was the invitation list. Caroline's winter ball in 1893 was smaller than usual. Not by much. Maybe 370 people instead of 400. But in a world where every absence was a message, 30 empty chairs screamed. The missing guests were not random. They were the ones who had attended events at the Waldorf, the ones who had dined in the Palm Room or rented the ballroom for their daughters' debuts, the ones who thought they could exist in both worlds, old money and new, Caroline's approval and the hotel's convenience. They were wrong. Caroline never announced the exclusions. She did not need to. The invitations simply did not arrive. And when those families realized they had been cut, they understood the terms. This was a civil war, and neutrality was not an option. You chose Caroline, or you chose the Waldorf. You could not choose both. The families who stayed loyal did so out of fear more than affection. Caroline controlled access to a network that still mattered, barely, in a city that was changing faster than etiquette could follow. If you wanted your daughter to marry into the right family, you needed Caroline's endorsement. If you wanted your business deals to carry social legitimacy, you needed her drawing room. The hotel could offer spectacle, but it could not offer pedigree. Not yet. William Waldorf's allies were fewer but louder. They were the new money families, the ones who had made fortunes in steel and railroads and did not care about Dutch ancestors. They liked the Waldorf because it felt like progress. It felt like America, unashamed and unapologetic. And they liked the fact that staying there annoyed Caroline Astor, because annoying Caroline Astor was proof you did not need her anymore. The split deepened. Dinner parties became battlegrounds. Invitations were analyzed like treaties. Who attended which event mattered more than what was said at the event itself. The city's elite, which had always operated on unspoken consensus, fractured into factions, each one testing the other's resolve. The tension inside the Astor family was worse. William Waldorf had cousins, nephews, nieces, all of them connected by blood and fortune. Some sided with Caroline, believing she represented the dignity of the name. Others sided with William Waldorf, or at least with the logic of his grievance, arguing that Caroline's monopoly on the title Mrs. Astor was petty and outdated. Most stayed silent, waiting to see who would win before committing to a side. The servants knew everything. They always did. Household staff moved between families, carrying gossip like currency. A maid who worked for the Livingstons one season might work for the Gillets the next. They heard the arguments. They saw the letters. They watched Caroline's face tighten every time someone mentioned the hotel. And they whispered about it in the kitchens and back stairwells, spinning the feud into legend. Some of the whispers turned strange. A footman at Caroline's house claimed he saw a woman in old-fashioned dress walking the second-floor hallway late one night, her gown trailing behind her like smoke. He followed her to the library, but when he opened the door, the room was empty. He told the other staff, who reminded him that the house was over 40 years old that shadows played tricks in gaslight, and that he had probably seen Caroline herself, mistaken her silhouette for something spectral. But the footman insisted. The dress was wrong. The walk was wrong. It was not Caroline. It was someone else, someone who did not belong. Other servants reported similar encounters. A cold spot in the conservatory that never warmed, even when the fire was lit. A door that opened on its own, then closed again, soft and deliberate. The sound of a piano playing in the music room when no one was at the keys, a melody that stopped the moment someone entered. The rational explanations were easy. The house was settling. The hotel's construction had destabilized the foundations across the block, creating shifts in pressure and airflow. Doors opened because hinges were loose. Cold spots existed because insulation was imperfect. The piano sound could have been vibrations from the street, from carriages passing, from any number of mundane sources. But rationality did not stop the stories. The servants wanted to believe in something beyond the mechanical. They wanted the house to have a soul, because if it had a soul, it could be haunted. And if it could be haunted, it mattered in a way that outlasted property deeds. The stories gave the mansion a mythology, a narrative weight that made it more than Caroline's residence. It became a character in its own right, wounded and restless. Caroline never acknowledged the stories. She did not believe in ghosts. She believed in control, and control was slipping. The hotel was still there. The noise was still constant. The social fracture was still widening. And William Waldorf, thousands of miles away in England, was winning without ever stepping foot in the city again. She needed a response, not a letter, not a complaint, not a quiet withdrawal from public life. She needed something visible, something permanent, something that would prove the Astor name still belonged to her and her alone. She needed to build. The decision came quickly once she made it. She would not leave Fifth Avenue. She would not concede the block. Instead, she would do what William Waldorf had done, only bigger, taller, and closer to his legacy than he could ever get to hers. She would tear down her own mansion, the fortress she had ruled from for decades, and replace it with a hotel of her own. A hotel that would make the Waldorf look like a rehearsal. The announcement went out in 1897. Caroline Astor was demolishing her home and building the Astoria Hotel, 16 stories, taller than the Waldorf, more rooms, more grandeur, right beside it, close enough to touch. The message was clear. If William Waldorf wanted a war fought with architecture, she would burn her own castle to win it. Caroline's answer is taller than hate. She does not beg, she demolishes, and the sound of falling stone becomes her declaration of war. The demolition began in the summer of 1897. Workers arrived with sledgehammers and crowbars, tearing into the mansion that had defined New York society for 30 years. They started with the interiors, ripping out silk wallpaper and carved molding, hauling furniture into the street to be sold or stored. The ballroom where 400 names had glittered came apart in sections, the mirrors smashed, the chandeliers crated and shipped to Caroline's new residence uptown. It took 6 weeks to reduce the house to rubble, 6 weeks to erase the physical space where American aristocracy had performed itself. The walls came down floor by floor, exposing rooms that had never seen daylight, revealing the private architecture of power, servants' quarters, storage closets, the hidden staircases that allowed staff to move invisibly. All of it dragged into public view, then demolished. Caroline did not watch. She had already moved to a new mansion at 65th Street and 5th Avenue, farther north, away from the noise and the hotel and the battlefield she was about to consecrate. But she gave the orders. She signed the contracts. She made it clear that this was not surrender. This was scorched earth. The Astoria Hotel rose in her mansion's place. 16 stories of brick and limestone, designed by the same architect who had built the Waldorf, Henry Hardenberg. The style was German Renaissance revival, matching the hotel next door, because the plan was not to compete aesthetically. It was to dwarf. The Astoria would have 400 rooms, slightly fewer than the Waldorf, but the rooms would be larger, the ceilings higher, the public spaces more opulent. This was not about efficiency. This was about making a statement that could be measured in floors. The construction cost $4 million, a sum so vast it required explanation. $4 million in 1897 was the equivalent of over $130 million today. Caroline did not need the money. She did not expect the hotel to turn a profit for years, if ever. She was building a monument to spite, and spite does not calculate return on investment. The timeline was brutal. Hardenberg pushed his crews to work through winters and summers, completing the hotel in just under 2 years. By November 1897, the Astoria was ready. The exterior was finished. The interiors were furnished. The staff was hired. And the building stood beside the Waldorf like a tower built to block out the sun. The two hotels now shared a courtyard, a narrow strip of open space between their facades. It was called Peacock Alley, a corridor where guests from both hotels could walk, socialize, and be seen. The name was ironic. Peacocks display their feathers to attract mates. These guests displayed their wealth to humiliate rivals. The alley was less than 50 feet wide, and it became the most famous 50 feet in New York, a catwalk for the rich, and a reminder that the Astor family feud had turned Fifth Avenue into a stage. The Astoria employed 250 staff members at opening, doormen in livery, chambermaids in crisp white aprons, chefs trained in European kitchens, concierges who spoke 4 languages. The hotel operated with military precision, and every detail was designed to suggest that this was not just a business. This was a legacy asserting itself. The grand ballroom could hold 1,500 people, 50% larger than the Waldorf's capacity. The dining room stretched across 4,000 square feet, with tables set in white linen and silverware polished to mirror brightness. The lobby featured marble imported from Italy, columns carved with decorative flourishes, and a ceiling painted with allegorical scenes of commerce and abundance. It was excessive. It was intentional. Caroline never stayed there. She visited once on opening night, walking through the public rooms with the same expression she had worn in her old ballroom, the one that said, "This place exists because I allow it to exist." Then she left. The Astoria was not her home. It was her revenge. George Bolt, the manager of the Waldorf, saw an opportunity. 2 massive hotels, side by side, owned by the same fractured family. He approached both sides with a proposal: merge them, combine operations, create a single entity, the Waldorf Astoria, and run it as the largest, most luxurious hotel in the world. It would end the feud, or at least bury it under profitability. The negotiations were cold. William Waldorf's representative spoke for him from London. Caroline's lawyers represented her from uptown. Neither side wanted to concede. But neither side could afford to keep losing money on a vanity war. The hotels were expensive to run. The competition was cannibalizing both their revenues, and the city, for all its fascination with the spectacle, had other places to stay. They reached an agreement in 1897. The Waldorf and the Astoria would be connected by a corridor, the same Peacock Alley that already existed. They would share some services. They would market themselves as a single destination, but they would keep separate identities, separate entrances, and separate management structures. It was a merger in name only, a truce that preserved the war in miniature. The combined Waldorf Astoria had 930 rooms. It employed 550 staff members. It covered an entire city block from 33rd Street to 34th Street, 5th Avenue to the side streets. It was the largest hotel in the world at the time of its completion, and it existed because two members of the same family refused to share the same title. The block, that had once been a row of private mansions, quiet and exclusive, was now a monument to commercial luxury. The Vanderbilts looked at it and started planning their own exit. The Whitneys reconsidered their commitment to Fifth Avenue. The message was clear. The street was no longer theirs. It belonged to whoever could build the tallest, spend the most, and attract the largest crowd. Caroline had won, in the sense that she had matched William Waldorf's insult with a taller insult. But she had also lost because the world she had ruled, the world of private balls and invitation lists and social fortresses, was now buried under 13 and 16 stories of public performance. The Astoria proved she could still command architects and contractors. But it also proved that her power required destruction, and destruction always costs more than it gains. The Astor name was now synonymous with luxury, but it was also synonymous with fracture. And the city watched, fascinated, as the dynasty turned its own fortune into a monument no one in the family would ever call home. 2 palaces, 1 family funeral. The city celebrates the spectacle, but inside the Astor name, something essential has already died. The Waldorf Astoria became an instant landmark. Guidebooks described it in breathless prose. Visitors from Europe toured it like a museum. New Yorkers who could afford the rates stayed there to say they had stayed there, to participate in the mythology of the building. It was not just a hotel, it was proof that American wealth could rival anything the old world had built, and do it faster, louder, and with better plumbing. The combined hotel hosted presidents. Theodore Roosevelt dined there. So did William Howard Taft. Celebrities from the stage and opera circuit rented suites for weeks at a time, treating the hotel like a second residence. Business magnates negotiated deals in the private dining rooms, where the walls were thick enough to keep secrets and the staff was trained to forget everything they overheard. The menus were legendary. Waldorf salad was invented there, a mix of apples, celery, and mayonnaise that became a signature dish. Eggs Benedict supposedly originated in the hotel's kitchens, though several other establishments claimed the same honor. Thousand Island dressing, veal Oscar, recipes that entered the American culinary canon, all of them born in a building constructed to settle a family grudge. But the grandeur was a performance, and the performance required constant maintenance. The hotel cost a fortune to operate. Heating 930 rooms in winter required coal deliveries every day, tons of it, shoveled into basement furnaces by crews working in shifts. The electric lighting, one of the hotel's major selling points, ran on generators that broke down regularly. The elevators needed constant adjustment. The plumbing, which served hundreds of bathrooms simultaneously, clogged and leaked and demanded round-the-clock attention from engineers. The The staff turnover was high. Working at the Waldorf Astoria sounded prestigious, but the labor was brutal. Chambermaids cleaned 15 rooms a day, hauling linens up and down service stairs because the elevators were reserved for guests. Kitchen staff worked 16-hour shifts during banquet season, preparing meals for events that hosted thousands. Doormen stood outside in all weather, smiling through snow and summer heat, because the hotel's reputation depended on the illusion that service was effortless. The guests noticed none of this. They saw marble and silk and uniformed attendants who appeared the moment they were needed. They experienced luxury as a frictionless dream, and that dream cost the hotel a small fortune in wages, repairs, and the kind of invisible labor that kept the machine running. George Bolt ran the operation with the precision of a general. He knew every department, every cost, every inefficiency. He fired managers who failed to meet his standards and rewarded those who exceeded them. Under his leadership, the Waldorf Astoria became profitable barely after years of hemorrhaging money. But profit was not the goal. The goal was prestige, and prestige was expensive. The hotel hosted events that defined the era, charity balls that raised thousands for hospitals and orphanages, political fundraisers where senators and governors worked the room, shaking hands and making promises, weddings for families whose names filled the society pages, ceremonies so elaborate they required weeks of preparation and involved florists, orchestras, caterers, and decorators who transformed the ballrooms into fantasy lands. But underneath the spectacle, the Astor family remained fractured. William Waldorf never returned to New York. He stayed in England, eventually buying a British title and becoming Viscount Astor, a move that confirmed what New York society had always suspected, that he cared more about rank than belonging. His children grew up British, speaking with British accents, attending British schools, disconnected from the American branch of the family entirely. Caroline continued hosting her own events uptown, smaller now, quieter, but still exclusive. She never set foot in the Waldorf Astoria after opening night. To her, the building was a necessary evil, a piece of real estate that generated income but held no emotional weight. Her ballroom was gone. Her mansion was gone. What remained was a hotel filled with strangers, and strangers were not her concern. The rest of the family watched the rift widen. Some tried to mediate. Others chose sides. Most simply accepted that the Astor name, once synonymous with unity and dominance, now meant division. The hotels were monuments to that division, temples of hospitality built from hostility, proof that even the wealthiest families could destroy themselves over pride. Fifth Avenue itself was transforming. The Waldorf Astoria's success inspired others. The Bar Plaza Hotel opened in 1907, grander and more expensive. The St. Regis followed. One by one, the old mansions came down, replaced by hotels and apartment buildings that catered to a different kind of wealth, the kind that moved and spent and demanded services instead of silence. The avenue's character shifted. It was no longer a private enclave. It was a commercial corridor, a destination for tourists and businessmen, and anyone willing to pay the price of admission. The families who had ruled it for generations began their slow retreat north to quieter streets where the buildings were still low and the neighbors still knew each other's names. By the early 1900s, Fifth Avenue below 50th Street was almost entirely commercial. Retail shops, office buildings, hotels. The transformation took less than 20 years, and the Waldorf Astoria was the catalyst. It proved that commerce could outcompete aristocracy, that money spent loudly was more powerful than money inherited quietly. Caroline Astor died in 1908 at the age of 78. Her obituaries praised her as the last queen of New York society, a woman who had defined an era and held it together through sheer force of will. They did not mention the hotel. They did not need to. Everyone knew. The Waldorf Astoria was her monument and her tomb, the building that proved she could still command architects even as it confirmed that her kind of power was finished. The Astor name survived, the fortune survived, but the unity did not. The family became a collection of separate branches, each one managing its own wealth, pursuing its own ambitions, connected by blood but not by loyalty. The hotel stood as proof that spite could build empires, but it could not hold families together. And every guest who checked in, every visitor who marveled at the ballrooms and the dining rooms and the sheer scale of the place, was walking through the remains of a civil war fought with marble and malice. The Waldorf Astoria is born in surrender. The greatest symbol of unity in American luxury is created because neither side can afford to keep losing. The formal merger in 1897 did not heal the feud. It buried it. The Waldorf Astoria became a single brand, a unified name, but the division remained encoded in its architecture. The Waldorf entrance faced Fifth Avenue at 33rd Street. The Astoria entrance faced Fifth Avenue at 34th Street. Two doors, two identities, two halves of the same grudge. Peacock Alley connected them, a corridor 300 feet long and 15 feet wide, lined with mirrors and potted palms. It was designed to encourage mingling, to blur the line between the two hotels, to make guests forget they were walking through contested territory. But everyone who used it knew the history. The corridor was not neutral ground. It was the seam where the war had been stitched shut. The staff learned to navigate the division carefully. Waldorf employees wore one uniform. Astoria employees wore another. The housekeeping departments operated separately. The kitchens coordinated menus but kept separate inventories. Even the accounting was split, tracking revenue and expenses for each hotel individually, as if the merger were a legal fiction and the rivalry still operational. George Bolt managed both sides, but he answered to separate owners. William Waldorf's estate controlled the Waldorf. Caroline's estate controlled the Astoria. Bolt's genius was in making the operation look seamless while preserving the autonomy each side demanded. He scheduled events so they did not overlap. He ensured neither hotel outshone the other in the press. He balanced the ledger so neither side could claim they were subsidizing the other's incompetence. It was exhausting, but it worked. The Waldorf Astoria became the standard against which all other luxury hotels were measured. When the Ritz opened in Paris, critics compared it to the Waldorf Astoria. When the Savoy in London renovated, they studied the Waldorf Astoria's service model. The building was not just a hotel, it was a template, a vision of what hospitality could become when money was no obstacle. The public spaces were theaters. The main dining room served 3,000 meals a day during peak season, a logistical feat that required precision timing and industrial-scale kitchens. The chefs worked in assembly lines, plating courses in synchronized waves. The waiters moved like dancers, carrying trays without spilling, clearing tables without interrupting conversation. The dining room was loud, bright, filled with the sound of silverware and laughter and deal-making. It was the opposite of Caroline's private dinners, where conversation was controlled and every word mattered. Here, volume was the point. The ballrooms hosted events that spanned days. debutante seasons, charity galas, corporate celebrations. The rooms could be reconfigured in hours, walls moved, stages built, lighting adjusted to transform the space from formal to festive. The hotel employed a team of decorators who specialized in rapid transformations, turning the ballrooms into winter wonderlands or tropical gardens or whatever fantasy the client requested. The guest rooms ranged from modest to absurd. A standard room cost $8 a night in the early 1900s, expensive but within reach for upper-middle-class travelers. A suite could cost $50 a night or more, depending on size and location. The most expensive suites occupied entire floors with private dining rooms, multiple bedrooms, and views that stretched across the city. Heads of state stayed in them, industrial barons, opera stars, anyone who needed to project power through their accommodations. The hotel's reputation was built on discretion. What happened in the Waldorf Astoria stayed in the Waldorf Astoria, at least officially. The staff was trained to be invisible, to witness everything and repeat nothing. Affairs were conducted in the privacy of the suites. Business deals were negotiated over cigars in the smoking rooms. Political alliances were formed and broken over breakfast in the private dining areas. The hotel became a node in the network of American power, a place where decisions were made away from public scrutiny. But the discretion had limits. Gossip leaked. Scandals emerged. In 1906, a murder took place in one of the suites. A showgirl named Evelyn Nesbit's husband, Harry Thaw, shot and killed the architect Stanford White in the hotel's rooftop theater. The trial became a sensation, filled with testimony about jealousy, obsession, and the kinds of secrets wealthy men thought they could keep hidden. The Waldorf Astoria's name appeared in every headline, and the hotel's management worked furiously to control the narrative, emphasizing that the crime was an aberration, not a reflection of the clientele. The building itself began to acquire stories, not just gossip, but legends. Guests reported seeing figures in the hallways late at night, people in old-fashioned clothing who vanished when approached. Staff whispered about cold spots in certain rooms, doors that would not stay closed, elevators that stopped on floors no one had requested. The stories were persistent enough that they became part of the hotel's mythology, shared between guests and staff as a kind of unofficial lore. The rational explanations were simple. The hotel was enormous. It had over 900 rooms, dozens of staircases, miles of corridors. It was easy to get lost, to mistake one guest for another, to see someone turn a corner and assume they had disappeared when they had simply walked out of sight. The cold spots were likely due to uneven heating, a consequence of trying to warm a building that size with early 20th century technology. The elevators were mechanical, prone to glitches, occasionally stopping at random floors because of electrical faults. But rationality did not stop the stories. They persisted because they gave the hotel a soul, a sense that it was more than a collection of rooms and services. The guests wanted to believe they were staying somewhere haunted, because haunted meant history, and history meant significance. The Waldorf Astoria was happy to let them believe, as long as the belief did not interfere with bookings. The hotel's cultural influence spread beyond its walls. Fashion designers debuted their latest collections at Waldorf Astoria events. Musicians premiered new compositions in the ballrooms. Writers used the hotel as a setting for novels, describing it as a place where American ambition put on its finest clothes and pretended aristocracy was something you could buy by the night. And through it all, the Astor family remained divided. William Waldorf's children inherited his British title and his distance from New York. Caroline's descendants stayed in America, but scattered, managing their fortunes independently, no longer bound by the social structures she had enforced. The family name remained famous, but it no longer meant unity. It meant wealth, influence, and the kind of historical weight that comes from building monuments to your own dysfunction. The Waldorf Astoria was that monument, a palace born from surrender, a symbol of unity that everyone knew was a lie. And it worked brilliantly because the lie was more compelling than the truth. The block that ate, Fifth Avenue, alive. What began as a feud becomes a blueprint, and suddenly every mansion owner realizes the street can betray them. The Waldorf Astoria's success did not just change one block, it changed the logic of the entire avenue. Fifth Avenue had been built on a simple premise. Private wealth required private space. The mansions were fortresses designed to keep the world out and preserve the illusion that money could buy permanent seclusion. But the Waldorf Astoria proved the opposite. It proved that wealth could be louder, more visible, more profitable when it invited the public in. The economics were undeniable. A mansion, no matter how grand, generated no income. It consumed money, maintenance, staff, taxes. It was a monument to the fact that the family could afford to spend without earning. But a hotel, especially one as large and prestigious as the Waldorf Astoria, could generate millions. The building paid for itself, then kept paying. And the families who watched Caroline and William Waldorf fight their war began to do the math. The Vanderbilts were the first to follow. Cornelius Vanderbilt had built a massive French chateau-style mansion at 5th Avenue and 57th Street, a building so opulent it made other mansions look restrained. But by the early 1900s, the family was questioning whether they wanted to maintain it. The city was changing. The neighborhood was getting louder. And the hotel model, pioneered by the Astors, looked increasingly attractive. The Vanderbilt mansion came down in stages over the next few decades, replaced first by commercial buildings, then by Bergdorf Goodman, a luxury department store that catered to the same clientele the mansion had once hosted privately. The transformation was symbolic. The street was no longer about living. It was about shopping, staying, spending. The private fortresses gave way to public temples of consumption. Other families made the same calculation. The Whitneys, the Havemeyers, the Rhinelanders. One by one, the mansions were demolished or converted. Some became clubs. Others became office buildings. A few were sold to institutions, turned into museums or cultural centers. But the residential era was over. Fifth Avenue below Central Park became a commercial corridor, and the families who had once ruled it moved north to quieter blocks where the buildings were still low and the streets still felt private. The economic scale was staggering. By 1920, the ED Waldorf Astoria was generating an estimated $3 million in annual revenue, equivalent to over $40 million today. The hotel employed over 800 staff at peak seasons: chambermaids, cooks, engineers, electricians, doormen, porters, drivers, an entire invisible city dedicated to serving the visible one. The property itself was worth an estimated $20 million by the mid-1920s, a value that dwarfed what any single-family mansion could command. The land beneath the hotel, a full city block in the heart of Manhattan, was some of the most expensive real estate in the world. And it was all being used to host strangers, people who stayed for a night or a week, then left. replaced by new strangers in an endless cycle of transience. The hotel's reach extended beyond lodging. The Waldorf Astoria became a social hub, a place where business deals were negotiated and political alliances formed. The Empire Room, one of the hotel's premier dining spaces, could seat 400 guests. It hosted everything from corporate banquets to presidential campaign events. The room's kitchen could produce 1,000 meals in a single evening, a feat of logistics that required military-level coordination. The hotel's staff operated with precision. The housekeeping department managed 930 rooms, ensuring each one was cleaned, restocked, and ready for the next guest within hours of checkout. The laundry processed thousands of pounds of linens daily, sheets and towels and tablecloths that had to be washed, pressed, and returned to service without delay. The engineering team maintained the building's infrastructure, fixing leaks, adjusting heating, ensuring the elevators ran smoothly and the lights stayed on. The hotel also employed a small army of specialists, florists who arranged fresh flowers for the public spaces daily, musicians who performed in the lobbies and dining rooms, tailors who could alter a guest's suit overnight, concierges who spoke multiple languages and could secure tickets to sold-out shows or reservations at impossible restaurants. The service was not just hospitality, it was spectacle, a demonstration that enough money could make anything possible. But the spectacle came at a cost. The hotel burned through coal in winter and ice in summer, cooling systems that involved hauling tons of ice into the basement and letting it melt through ventilation shafts. The electric bill alone ran into thousands of dollars monthly, a consequence of keeping nearly 1,000 rooms lit and heated or cooled simultaneously. The food costs were astronomical, with the kitchen sourcing ingredients from around the world, importing champagne from France and oysters from the coast, and cuts of meat that had to meet exact specifications. The financial pressure was constant. The hotel had to stay full to remain profitable. Empty rooms were lost revenue, and lost revenue compounded quickly when operating costs were fixed and high. George Bolt and his successors became masters of yield management, adjusting prices based on demand, offering discounts during slow seasons, raising rates during holidays and major events. The goal was always the same: maximize occupancy without cheapening the brand. By the 1920s, Fifth Avenue was unrecognizable. The quiet street of private mansions had become a canyon of skyscrapers. Retail stores occupied the ground floors. Office buildings rose above them. Hotels competed for attention, each one taller and more elaborate than the last. The Plaza, the St. Regis, the Sherry Netherland, all of them following the blueprint the Waldorf Astoria had established. Luxury as a public performance, wealth as a destination, hospitality as industry. The social consequences were profound. The old families who had defined New York society found themselves irrelevant. Their guest lists no longer mattered. Their approval no longer controlled who succeeded and who failed. The city had moved beyond them, embraced a new model where money talked and pedigree whispered. The Waldorf Astoria was not just a hotel. It was the instrument of that transformation. The building that proved the future belonged to whoever could build the tallest and charge the most. And at the center of it all was the Astor family, still fractured, still wealthy, but no longer unified. The hotels they had built to hurt each other had become institutions that outlasted their control. The Waldorf Astoria was no longer theirs in any meaningful sense. It was a brand, a business, a piece of cultural infrastructure that belonged to the city and the world. The family name was carved into the facade, but the building had outgrown them, become something larger and stranger than revenge. Fifth Avenue had eaten itself alive, consumed by the logic the Astors had unleashed. And the families who survived did so by accepting the new rules: build tall, spend loud, and never confuse legacy with permanence. The original palace vanishes overnight. The most famous hotel on earth gets erased, and New York barely pauses long enough to mourn it. By the late 1920s, the Waldorf Astoria faced a problem no amount of luxury could solve. The land beneath it was worth more than the building on top of it. Manhattan real estate had become so valuable that even a legendary hotel could not justify occupying an entire city block when that block could support something taller, denser, more profitable. The decision came in 1929. The hotel would be demolished, the site would be sold, and in its place, a new skyscraper would rise, taller than anything the city had seen: the Empire State Building, a monument to vertical ambition that would dwarf everything around it, including the memory of the hotel it replaced. The announcement shocked the city, but not for long. New York was a place that devoured its own history, rebuilt itself every generation, treated permanence as a weakness. The Waldorf Astoria had stood for 32 years. That was a long run for a building in a city that measured time in construction cycles. The guests mourned. The staff scrambled for new jobs, and the demolition crews prepared to erase one of the most famous addresses on Earth. The final night was May 1st, 1929. The hotel hosted a farewell ball, a grand event attended by everyone who had ever mattered in New York society. The ballrooms were full, the champagne flowed, the orchestra played late into the night, and at midnight the last guests walked out through Peacock Alley, past the mirrors and the palms, into a city that was already forgetting. The demolition took 18 months. Crews worked in shifts, tearing the building apart floor by floor, salvaging what they could, and hauling the rest to landfills. The marble was sold to other hotels. The chandeliers were auctioned. The brass fixtures were melted down. Everything that could be reused was stripped away, and what remained was rubble. The staff told stories about the final days. Workers claimed they heard footsteps in empty corridors, doors closing in rooms that had already been gutted. One crew reported finding a ballroom on the 10th floor, still set for a dinner that had never happened. Tables dressed in white linen, silverware arranged, as if the building were trying to hold on to one last event. They checked the records. No event had been scheduled. The room was cleared the next day. The rational explanation was simple. The hotel had hosted thousands of events over 3 decades. Rooms were set and reset constantly. It was likely someone had prepared the ballroom for a canceled event and forgotten to clear it, or perhaps the crew had misremembered which floor they were on. Buildings that size were disorienting, especially when half demolished. Memory played tricks, but the stories persisted. The Waldorf Astoria had become more than a building. It had become a character in the city's mythology, a place where so much had happened that it seemed impossible for it to simply disappear. The guests who had stayed there, the staff who had worked there, even the people who had only read about it in the papers, all felt the loss in a way that was hard to articulate. It was not grief, exactly. It was more like vertigo, the feeling that something permanent had been revealed as temporary. The Astor family watched from a distance. William Waldorf had died in 1919, still in England, still holding his British title. His children inherited his fortune, but not his grudge. Caroline had died in 1908, her reign over New York society already fading by the time of her death. The family members who remained were scattered, managing separate fortunes, pursuing separate lives. The hotel had outlasted the feud, but only barely. The demolition site became a spectacle. Tourists came to watch the building come down, taking photographs of the rubble, collecting bricks as souvenirs. The city treated it like an event, a public performance of progress. And when the last stone was hauled away, the site was empty, a flat expanse of dirt in the middle of Manhattan, waiting for the next monument. But the Waldorf Astoria name did not die. It moved. In 1931, a new Waldorf Astoria opened on Park Avenue between 49th and 50th Streets. The new building was taller, grander, more modern. It had 47 floors, over 1,400 rooms, and Art Deco interiors that made the original hotel look Victorian. It was designed to be the tallest hotel in the world, a title it held for decades. The new Waldorf Astoria carried the old name, but it was a different building in every way that mattered. The original had been born from a family feud, built on spite and pride and the need to dominate a single block of Fifth Avenue. The new one was built by a corporation, designed to maximize profit, engineered to serve a global clientele. It was still luxurious, still prestigious, but it was no longer personal. The old hotel's spirit, if it had one, did not make the move. The stories stayed on Fifth Avenue, lingering in the empty lot where the Empire State Building would soon rise. Construction workers on the new skyscraper reported strange occurrences. Tools going missing, cold drafts in the basement, the sound of music drifting up from the foundation, faint and distant, like an echo from a party that had ended decades ago. The explanations were mundane. Construction sites were chaotic. Tools were misplaced constantly. Drafts were inevitable in unfinished buildings. And the music could have been anything, sound carrying from the street, vibrations from the subway, the workers' own radios playing in distant corners of the site. But the stories became part of the Empire State Building's lore, a reminder that the land had been something else before, something grander and stranger, a palace built from anger. The Waldorf Astoria's demolition marked the end of an era. The last of the Fifth Avenue mansions were gone or converted. The street belonged entirely to commerce now, a corridor of retail and office space where the only residents were hotels and their transient guests. The transformation the Astors had started was complete. The block had eaten itself, and what remained was taller, richer, and emptier than anything Caroline or William Waldorf had imagined. The original Waldorf Astoria was gone, but its legacy was permanent, encoded into the city's DNA. It had proven that buildings could be weapons, that architecture could settle scores, and that spite, when given enough money and ambition, could build monuments that outlasted the people who inspired them. Luxury that still smells like revenge. Even in the new Waldorf Astoria, the myth persists because spite is the one ingredient that never spoils. The new Waldorf Astoria on Park Avenue opened during the Great Depression, a questionable business decision that somehow became a triumph. The country was broke, banks were failing, unemployment was climbing, and into that wreckage stepped a hotel charging $20 a night for a standard room, a price that would have been outrageous even in boom times. But the hotel filled anyway, not immediately, not completely, but enough to survive, then thrive. The clientele was different now. Fewer aristocrats, more industrialists, fewer old money families, more celebrities. The The guest list included presidents and prime ministers, movie stars and mobsters, anyone who needed to project power through their accommodations. The hotel became a stage, and the performance was always the same. I can afford to be here, therefore I matter. The building itself was a masterpiece of Art Deco design. The lobby featured murals by famous artists. The ballrooms had ceilings covered in gold leaf. The suites were enormous, some occupying entire floors, with private elevators and kitchens and staff quarters for the guests' personal servants. The most expensive suite, the presidential suite, cost hundreds of dollars a night, a sum that bought you not just space, but status, the ability to say you had stayed where presidents stayed. The hotel employed over 1,500 staff at peak capacity. The kitchen could produce 5,000 meals a day. The laundry processed over 30,000 pounds of linens weekly. The engineering department maintained a building that functioned like a small city, with its own power generators, water systems, and climate control. The scale was industrial, but the presentation was seamless. Guests saw luxury, staff saw logistics. The Waldorf Astoria became famous for its events. The annual April in Paris ball raised millions for charities. Presidential inaugurations were celebrated in the ballrooms. Foreign dignitaries stayed in the towers, conducting diplomacy from suites that overlooked the city. The hotel was not just a place to sleep. It was a venue for history, a location where decisions were made and alliances formed. But the hotel also carried the old stories. Staff whispered about strange occurrences, just as they had in the original building. Guests reported hearing music in empty corridors. Elevators stopped on floors no one had requested. Cold spots appeared in certain rooms. Drafts that could not be explained by faulty windows or uneven heating. The stories were never confirmed, never denied. They simply persisted, part of the hotel's unofficial lore. The rational explanations were the same as they had been on Fifth Avenue. The building was enormous, over 1,400 rooms, hundreds of corridors, dozens of staircases and elevators. It was easy to get lost, to hear sounds from distant parts of the building and mistake them for something closer, something stranger. The elevators were mechanical, prone to glitches. The heating system was complex, and complex systems developed quirks. None of it required ghosts. All of it could be explained by engineering and acoustics and the power of suggestion. But the guests wanted to believe. They wanted the Waldorf Astoria to be haunted, because haunted meant history, and history meant significance. Staying in a haunted hotel was more interesting than staying in a well-managed one. The management understood this. They never promoted the stories, but they never discouraged them either. The mystery was good for business. The hotel's cultural reach was global. The Waldorf Astoria name appeared in movies, novels, songs. It became shorthand for luxury, a reference everyone understood. To stay at the Waldorf Astoria meant you had arrived, that you had achieved a level of success worth celebrating. The hotel was not just a building, it was a symbol, a marker of status that transcended geography. And through it all, the Astor family remained in the background. They no longer owned the hotel. They no longer controlled its operations. The name was theirs, but the building belonged to corporations and investors who cared about profit margins, not family feuds. The Astors had become irrelevant to the thing they had created, their legacy reduced to a name on a facade. But the myth endured, the story of Caroline and William Waldorf, of the spite that built 2 hotels and turned Fifth Avenue into a battlefield, became part of the Waldorf Astoria's identity. Guests asked about it. Tour guides repeated it. Historians wrote about it. The feud was no longer personal. It was promotional, a narrative that gave the hotel a story more compelling than marble and gold leaf. The new Waldorf Astoria outlasted the original by decades. It hosted events through wars and recessions, through cultural shifts and technological revolutions. Presidents continued to stay there, celebrities continued to perform there, and the building continued to stand, a monument to the idea that luxury could be industrialized, that hospitality could be scaled, that the excesses of the rich could be packaged and sold to anyone willing to pay. But the cost was still there, buried in the foundation. The Waldorf Astoria existed because two people hated each other enough to destroy their own homes and build monuments to their anger. That hatred was the hotel's origin story, and no amount of Art Deco glamour could erase it. Every guest who stayed there, whether they knew it or not, was sleeping inside a family war, surrounded by the ghosts of a grudge that had outlived everyone who started it. The Waldorf Astoria became immortal. The Astor family unity did not, and the world moved on, building taller hotels, creating new symbols of luxury, forgetting the original Fifth Avenue palace while remembering the name. Because names, unlike buildings, do not need foundations. They just need stories. And the Waldorf Astoria had the best story money could buy. A dynasty that ate itself to prove a point, then sold tickets to the feast. The dynasty that won then. Lost the Astors, built a monument the world remembers, and paid for it with the one thing their money could not rebuild. The Astor family is still wealthy. The fortune, built on Manhattan real estate and managed across generations, survived the feuds and the hotels and the transformations of the city. The descendants live around the world, managing investments, running foundations, carrying a name that still means something in the small circles where old money is discussed. But they are no longer a dynasty. They are a collection of individuals bound by blood, but not by purpose. The unity that Caroline Astor enforced, the sense that the family was a single entity with a shared identity, died the moment William Waldorf built his hotel. The Waldorf Astoria was the monument to that death, a building that proved wealth could survive division, but power could not. The family controlled fortunes, but they no longer controlled narratives. The city had moved on. The world had moved on. And the Astors became a historical footnote, famous for what they built, not for who they were. The hotels carried the feud into the future, but they also sanitized it. The Waldorf Astoria became a brand, a logo, a symbol of luxury divorced from the personal anger that created it. Guests did not think about Caroline or William Waldorf when they checked in. They thought about thread count and room service, and the prestige of saying they had stayed there. The story became marketing, and marketing erased the pain. But the pain was real. Caroline Astor spent her final years watching her world collapse. The social structures she had built, the invitations and guest lists and unspoken rules, all of it became irrelevant in a city that valued commerce over pedigree. She died knowing she had won the battle against William Waldorf, but lost the war against modernity. Her ballroom was demolished. Her mansion was rubble, and the hotel that bore her spite was filled with strangers who did not care who she was. William Waldorf fared better, at least materially. He bought his British title, became Viscount Astor, and spent his remaining years in England surrounded by estates and deference. But he never returned to New York. He never saw the city again. His hotel, the Waldorf, became part of something larger, merged with Caroline's revenge, and the combination outlasted him. He died wealthy and titled, but also exiled, a man who had won his argument by leaving the country. The lesson, if there is one, is not about money. The Astors never ran out of money. The lesson is about what money cannot buy. It cannot buy reconciliation. It cannot buy unity. It cannot buy the kind of legacy that holds families together across generations. The Waldorf Astoria is a monument to wealth, but it is also a monument to fracture, a building that proves you can have all the money in the world and still lose everything that matters. The viewer watching this story might see their own world in it, not the scale, not the millions of dollars or the Fifth Avenue mansions, but the underlying logic, the way status becomes currency, the way pride becomes architecture, the way families build monuments to hurt each other, then wonder why the monuments feel empty. We live in a reputation economy now, just as the Astors did. Social media is the new guest list. Followers are the new invitations. And the fear of losing relevance, of being forgotten or surpassed, drives people to build and spend and perform in ways that would have made Caroline Astor nod in recognition. The tools have changed. The anxiety is the same. The Waldorf Astoria still stands, though the Park Avenue building was sold and converted in recent years, its future uncertain. The name survives in other locations, other cities, a brand that has been franchised and exported around the world. You can stay at a Waldorf Astoria in Dubai, in Beijing, in cities the original Astors never imagined. The hotels are luxurious, well managed, expensive, but they are not the same. They carry the name without carrying the history, the weight, the sense that this building was born from something darker than ambition. The original Fifth Avenue site, where the feud began, is now the Empire State Building, a skyscraper that has no memory of the hotels it replaced. Tourists visit it daily, riding elevators to the observation deck, taking photographs of the city spread below. They do not think about Caroline Astor or William Waldorf. They do not think about the mansion that was demolished or the hotel that rose in its place. The site has been overwritten, the history erased by vertical ambition, but the story persists. In archives, in history books, in documentaries like this one, because the story is useful. It teaches something about power, about family, about the cost of building monuments to prove a point. The Astors built the Waldorf Astoria to hurt each other, and in doing so, they built something that outlasted their pain. But they also built something that consumed them, that turned their name into a brand and their feud into folklore. When you build to hurt, what part of you gets sealed into the walls forever? For the Astors, it was everything. Their pride, their anger, their need to dominate. All of it encoded into limestone and marble, preserved in ballrooms and corridors, haunting the guests who never knew the full story. The hotels are beautiful. They are also tombs. And the dynasty that built them is still wealthy, still influential, but no longer whole. The Waldorf Astoria War ended with no winner. Caroline got her taller hotel. William Waldorf got his exile. The city got a monument. And the Astor name, once synonymous with unity and power, became a lesson in what happens when you turn architecture into a weapon. The buildings survive. The family does not in any meaningful sense. So the question remains, not just for the Astors, but for anyone watching. What are you building, and who is it really for? Because monuments last longer than grudges. And sometimes, the thing you build to prove you won becomes the proof that you lost.